So I got a request to do a couple more videos, and the videos are colonialism, steward presidents, and presidents nobody cares about, along with reconstruction. So let me take a bite out of that. Sorry that I didn't put up this video yesterday. I got a little bit busy, and you know how things are. Anyways, I'm going to be going through this chronologically, so starting with colonialism, presidents that nobody cares about, and then moving on to reconstruction, so I'm going to be skipping over Civil War stuff. Unless you want me to make a video about that. Okay. Also, if you see me looking down, like, this way, sort of, I'm looking at this book. This is the second edition of AP US History Crash Course. If you have a book that is AP US History Crash Course with a person studying intently on top of it, you'll know by the way it looks, please pull it out and take a look, because these things follow pretty much exactly the same way, and it'll be really helpful. If you don't have it, I mean, just listen to me. Alright, so starting with colonialism. Why was America colonized? First off, let's start with the Spanish and the French. These are the primary people who were colonizing back in the day. So, you may remember from A People's History of the America by Howard Zinn that there's a little section about how, you know, Christopher Columbus comes over, that's why it's called Columbia, we get the Columbian Exchange, and America's mascot until it's Uncle Sam is Columbia. Furthermore, you may also remember the fact that Cortez was a guy, Pizarro was a guy. These are people who came over to colonize America for the purposes of getting gold and doing this Columbian Exchange, so they don't really ever settle to live there very long. This is because a lot of the people coming over are explorers and not really, like, people who need a place to live. Now let's talk about those people who needed somewhere to live. Look at England. Look at America. Now look back at England. England is rocky, cold, rainy, and kind of not fun to be in. America's got all this great stuff. Gold, food. It's got land like you wouldn't believe, and that's one thing that English people need because, oh my god, there's like no place to live on England. It's like this little rock in the middle of the ocean. In any case, that's the reason why so many English people come over, and if you remember the words of John Smith, before they had even gone over there, a lot of advertising was done to say, oh, you can bring your apprentices there. If you're young, bring yourself over there. You'll get a lot of money. It's great. Self-explanatory, I mean. Alright, so, what was first European contact with the Native Americans? Well, considering English people, you have the Iroquois Confederacy. This is the confederacy, a government, basically, of Native Americans that were held together, and were pretty similar in a lot of respects to the governments that were established there in little villages, because, I mean, they kind of had to live the same sort of lifestyle. Similarities include living in villages, building strong communities, having gender-dividing labor, and being very strong spiritually, although we also know that America was not just for spiritual people, it was also for people who just didn't have that much in life. Let's get to that. So, plantation colonies. These are places that the Virginia Company was allowing people to settle in. The Virginia Company is basically like a land-owning company. They go over there, they scoop out a little part of land, and they say, hey, if you pay us, we'll give you a place to live. That's what the Virginia Company does. So people sail over, they go there, and then they say, hey, I don't want to pay the Virginia Company. So they settle just a little bit outside of the area that the Virginia Company sets. This is a pretty common thing up until the point where it's like, they start getting noticed and, ooh, surprise, Native Americans start attacking them. That's to be expected when you take someone's land. Anyways, so, I'm gonna keep looking over here. So, the cultivation of particular crops was pretty common. Let's say, I mean, indigo was very common, tobacco, cotton, obviously King Cotton later on antebellum America. So we have a couple different cash crops that are raised over there. This means that they needed indentured servants, and that was pretty much the way to go up until slavery ended up being more profitable. That's not to say that slavery started with cotton, but for a while it was more profitable to have indentured servants than to buy some, like, rich guy's slaves. That was, like, way more expensive than just bringing your own guy over. However, the shift to slavery started with Bacon's Rebellion. That's a bunch of indentured servants who basically get sick of being indentured servants and say, hey, we don't want this. And they say, okay, we'll just hire people who can't say no. So, let's talk about land in general. So we already talked about crops, we talked about slaves. Land itself was pretty important. Like I said, England's like some little rock in the middle of the ocean. Nobody really wants to live there, let alone nobody can have any place to live there. So when they come over to America, they're like, wow, we can't determine aristocracy based on land anymore. You know why? Because there's so much land. The only time that land stops is around the time of the 1800s. We get Turner's frontier thesis, which says that America didn't have a nobility because of the frontier. Good supporting detail. Anyways. So how did they determine who was rich and who wasn't? I mean, obviously there was a difference between people like Thomas Jefferson and people like Andrew Jackson. One of the differences was the HEADRIGHT system. The HEADRIGHT system basically allowed them to pass on things to their firstborn sons because they wanted to be able to determine aristocracy. People are more comfortable with things that are familiar to them rather than things that are super different. That's why when Washington ends up being the leader after the Revolutionary War, they kind of want to turn him into a king. They're familiar with it. Psychology. So let's talk about the religious side of things. Puritans. What were they? Well, Puritans are people that came over because they were religiously persecuted and they wanted to religiously persecute people. So they sail over in their little ship to Holland, and then they realize Holland's too liberal. They move to America because they say, hey, if we're all alone, we can just teach our kids and indoctrinate them all by ourselves, which is what they did. So, one of the main things of this is John Winthrop's City on a Hill. City on a Hill basically is this idea that the city would become a paragon of light, a city on a hill for everybody to see, and I guess the higher you get, the closer you are to God. Blaze it. Puritans didn't really want people to dissent from their religion, and that's why people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams kind of get the boot. Anne Hutchinson says, as a woman, that she gets visions from God, and this, I guess, pisses off all the old white guys who say, oh, only old white men can get visions from God. Anyways, so she gets sent off to Rhode Island. Who else gets sent off to Rhode Island? Rascally Roger Williams. He basically has this idea that church and state should be separate, and I guess they don't send Washington to Rhode Island, so I guess that idea kind of died out. He also believed in religious toleration, which Puritans were not about, I guess, so they send him to Rhode Island. Again, Roger Williams is kind of the guy who really makes Rhode Island into an actual place. It used to be called the gutter of America, so that tells you about it. People can only stand being prejudiced for so long. I hope. Anyways, the halfway covenant becomes a thing, and this is basically where Puritans say, hey, we'll accept kids who are not technically Puritan, and we'll baptize them even if their parents aren't converted as well. But their parents also had to be baptized. It's a weird system. I don't know how that works. So, some key points to remember about the First Great Awakening. First Great Awakening is basically this idea that after the religious zeal began to diminish with the halfway covenant, then we see a difference in the way that religion is done. There's a difference between New Light and Old Light ministers. What's the difference? New Light ministers are the new ones, as their name implies, and they basically say, hey, you can be religious and emotional at the same time. In fact, you should love God. What did New Light ministers do? Well, they started new education systems such as Princeton, which, surprise, surprise, is older than a lot of things you'd think it'd be older than. Anyways, starts Princeton, education systems. They end up renewing their faith through emotions, so, as well as converting African slaves into religion. This religious zeal for African Americans is going to carry on further into stuff I discussed during my Jacksonian video, so if you want to get to that, click wherever I put the annotation, which I'm going to put right here in my hand. So, click there if you want to go to my Jacksonian video and hear me talk about antebellum America. Let's talk a little more about colonies. I know, this colonialism stuff gets a little long-winded. So, colonies-wise, we have Pennsylvania, that's William Penn and the Quakers, who, if you remember, were actually kind of religiously tolerant, and were nicer to ladies, so a step towards equality. Let's see. They advocated freedom of worship, and they also believed in pacifism, which is basically don't bear arms, don't fight against anybody, turn the other cheek type stuff. We're almost to the end of colonialism, I promise. So, who are the wealthy people in this society? Well, you get northern merchants, and you get southern planters. These people are the rich people, and we get northern people start being called tidewater gentry or coastal elite. I know, why would you name them something like that? It's just, AP does weird things, history does weird things. Tidewater gentry does sound kind of cool though, so maybe you'll remember it now. Tidewater gentry. And poorer people who tended to be from the south after a certain amount of time, obviously leading to Civil War stuff, were called backwater farmers. I mean, if we'd all been Protestant, why wouldn't we be Protestant now? Of course, our nation is built on a lot of ideals of that, but Establishment Clause says no establishing an official religion, so obviously we gotta follow the rules we write. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good government. So let's move on. So, why were the colonies created again? Let's say it all together. Money! Money's the reason for a lot of things happening in history. Surprise, surprise, people like money. So, mercantilism, or mercantilism, whichever way you want to say it, it's this idea that gold has to travel only in your place. It's an absolutism thing. If you remember from AP Euro last year, Louis XIV and his advisor come up with the idea of mercantilism to sustain France and make its economy as strong as its own power, i.e. political power. So you get a lot of things like the Navigation Acts. Navigation Acts is the main thing. They had a couple other smaller things, but like the Navigation Acts, they don't really do anything with them. Navigation Acts basically listed a bunch of stuff that they were only allowed to bring back and forth from England and nowhere else, because if America became more profitable than they were, then how are they going to stay the biggest power ever, even being a little rock in the middle of the ocean? So, Navigation Acts had this list of stuff, and yet they didn't really follow it, or follow through with really implementing it. Why? That's an idea of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect, healthful neglect, it basically meant that if you can have them be okay by leaving them on their own, then why bother? You may as well just leave them on their own, and then you don't have to do any work. That leads to the Revolutionary War. So, women in colonial America. Women in colonial America. During the colonial period, if you married, you lost your property, you lost yourself, you became property. All fun, happy times, isn't it? Most women don't really get any rights around this time, and that's why during the time when John Adams is in power, vice presidency, pseudo-power, I know, it's kind of just like a ceremonial position, Abigail Adams says, "I beg that you do not forget the ladies." That's because throughout her lifetime, colonial America, guess who doesn't get any power? Ladies. Around this time, Republican government becomes like a thing. Republicanism, not like the party, but a republic itself means that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, i.e. people control the government, who just keeps them safe. This was derived pretty strongly off of John Locke's stuff. You might remember reading that. Any colonial literature and art stuff you should remember? Well, because they were trying to survive, let's say Roanoke Colony, Croatoan, people dying left and right, Jamestown, for crying out loud, people don't really have that much time to do artsy stuff. However, we do get things like Anne Bradstreet, who was the first colonial lady to get some work published, and Phyllis Wheatley, first African-American woman to be published and started African-American literature. So, that's about it for colonialism. So, what does happen during the period between that, colonialism, and then getting to presidency? Well, you all might remember the Revolutionary War was a thing, so I'm not going to really go super in-depth to that. Basically, you get the French-Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. You get the Stamp Act, Coercive Act, Boston Tea Party, Revolutionary War, Battle of Saratoga, New York fighting, people dying, Revolutionary War happening. Surprise, we win, in case you didn't remember that. Declaration of Independence really becomes a document. Thomas Paine's common sense really worked out in the end. We establish the Articles of Confederation. We get a president. Now we're at presidents that people don't really care about all so much, i.e. presidents we don't really go into depth about their personal life. So, let's talk about these guys. So you get Washington, you get Alexander Hamilton alongside him, and you get John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. These are all people who are going to eventually become influential leaders at some point in their lives. However, we get Washington, who's only there because he's Washington, and everybody loves him. Frankly, Washington is kind of a big baby, and so when he gets criticized and when the House changes to Democratic, he instantly becomes regretful and says his farewell address, which you might remember we broke a lot of things of. You know, don't make political parties, don't make foreign relations. Oh gosh. So, Washington decides two-term presidency. That's not really, made official until after FDR runs so many times. FDR. Anyways, so after that you get Alexander Hamilton, Bank of America, Assumption. He's not really a president, of course, but he does have some pretty important economic points that come up. You get Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, that might ring a bell. Napoleon decides to sell off parts of America that he owns, French Louisiana, over to America because the Haitian Revolt is going on right at that point, and Napoleon can't deal with it because he doesn't have enough money. Yeah. French and Indian War happened. Just a reminder. During Thomas Jefferson's presidency, almost around the beginning, you get the case Marbury v. Madison. Madison, who is his secretary. Madison, who ends up going against the Supreme Court and technically winning the case because it establishes judicial review. And also the fact that the Supreme Court can't just, take cases, it's gotta be appealed up the ladder. Moving on from that, you don't really get that much importance from the presidents between because they're called steward presidents. Steward presidents, this sort of trend is broken by Andrew Jackson because Andrew Jackson just does whatever he wants, goes down into Spanish Florida, I don't even know. Steward presidents basically just let Congress do their thing and then they enforce it. Whereas Andrew Jackson starts off this sort of idea that presidents can hold political power, and of course this gets established throughout Cold War type stuff, and even into today, where the imperial presidency is still criticized. Arthur Schlesinger comes up with a book, and it's called The Imperial Presidency, and immediately after the book is published, 1970s, Congress comes up with these things like the War Powers Act, which basically limit the power of the presidency. But back in this time, steward presidents, they just kind of let Congress do their thing, they do their thing, everyone's happy, checks and balances, separation of powers, yay! You get a couple presidents like that during times where the presidents kind of just land in office without realizing that. You may or may not remember presidents who have had their wife die or their son die, and they're so paralyzed by grief, understandably, that they can't really do much in terms of presidency, so they kind of just let other people take charge. So, speaking of that, we don't really get anything. Steward presidents all the way. You get a little mention of James Monroe in this book here, which I'm going to hold up again in case you forgot which one I'm reading. It's AP US History Crash Course 2nd edition. There's a little mention of James Monroe and his presidency. That's 1817 to 1825. I'm going to look at the book. 1817 to 1825. Yes. And that's Clay's American System originates around that time. That's build canals, railroads. Oops. It doesn't help the South. Alright, finally we get to Reconstruction. I'm gonna jump over the Civil War section here because I think we really talked about that enough. And I mean, everybody knows about Lincoln and all the great stuff that happened with him. Emancipation Proclamation, Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Antietam. So, we're gonna move on. Also, I didn't get a request for that, but if you want me to, I can. Alright, so this one is Reconstruction. So, what is Reconstruction? Basically, South, North, fighting. What do you want to do? You want to bring them back together. After all, it is the United States of America. So, naturally, we want to bring them together. And that's what Lincoln is really trying to do, up until the point where he gets shot. Spoiler alert, Lincoln dies. So, John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln. Who gets to take over? Well, nobody's really been thinking about Reconstruction all that heavily, except for Lincoln balancing the ticket. Now, Lincoln is a pretty smart guy. We get a lot of really good things out of him, even if he was an imperial president, which by no means is a bad thing during a war. Sometimes it's a really good thing. In any case, Lincoln recognizes that the South does need reconciliation, and he knows how to balance the ticket by bringing a guy who's from the South but also has his loyalties, sort of, with the United States of America as a whole. Why does he think this? Well, Johnson's the only guy who ever comes into Congress after the southern states secede. He does have his loyalties, which I gotta commend him on. However, after he does end up getting into the presidency, we get a couple things happening. Let's remember who gets impeached. We have the all-important Nixon, who kind of gets impeached. We have Clinton for Monica Lewinsky, and we have Andrew Johnson. Why? Well, let's take a look. We still have people who, in Congress, are mostly dedicated to Lincoln. Republicans, so they get all the power. This is why they get to pass things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, because amendments are pretty hard to pass. You get no slavery, equality, voting rights. That's all great stuff. What happens during Reconstruction time? Slavery, no equality, no voting rights. Why? Why? I ask myself that too, even though I know the answer. So, we get a lot of things from Andrew Johnson where he really desperately does want the South to be part of the U.S. He just also wants it to be the main part of the U.S. Of course, because the South's been jilted, this makes a lot of sense emotionally, culturally, and, well, I guess it translates politically. He elects a bunch of Confederates to the House. We get some African Americans, which is a great thing. The last one leaves. Remember his name? George White. Irony. Gotta remember that stuff. Though we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Andrew Johnson doesn't really care about the black codes that get implemented. Those are unconstitutional. I mean, amendments, that's part of the Constitution. What's unconstitutional? Breaking the Constitution. What do the black codes do? You guessed it. Break the Constitution. But Andrew Johnson, of course, doesn't mind that sort of stuff because he's from the South. Programs and policies that happened during Reconstruction, how did they decide to reconstruct it? Well, they put the military into the South. I think this was not a very smart move, of course, because how is that going to help? You just spent an entire couple years fighting them, and then you decide to put more troops. Obviously, this makes Andrew Jackson mad. And this is why he gets impeached. These are called Reconstruction Acts, also known as Radical Reconstruction Acts, because of the radical Republicans who are in Congress and support the movement itself. So when Johnson starts saying, hey, I don't want you to do that, this is considered unconstitutional, and he gets sent in, gets impeached. However, he ends up sitting in office for a little while longer. He doesn't actually get booted out. So let me return back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and how they literally do not get followed, at all. Black codes, what are they? Also known as Jim Crow laws. Basically, these were things that made it impossible for people to vote. You can have voting rights, but if you can't actually get up to the booth, what are you gonna do? So, of course, there were military people trying to guard them as the military occupation was happening in the South, but there's only so many places you can go to help them. In this same sense, the North will eventually turn its back on blacks because it is really tiring to have Reconstruction. This is kind of why the Civil Rights Movement is happening still. So, let's move on. So what do black codes actually do? Making it harder meant things like literacy test, grandfather clause. These things are all really, really weird. If you've ever taken the SAT, the guy who wrote the SAT was the guy who knew how to write literacy tests and often wrote them so that immigrants couldn't come into the country. Does that explain why the SAT is terrible now? That's basically what a literacy test was, except a lot more unfair. Anybody who's been in AP Gov, you might know this a little bit, but there's a lot of things where it was to the discretion of the person in charge. So if they decided that's not right, even if it completely was right, well, they don't get to vote, I guess. There's a reason why we don't have those things anymore, although it is the Voting Rights Act. So if any time we need an actual, legitimate literacy test, not one to block people, we can basically rescind the act and get literacy tests. That's fun. Anyways, the 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment, sort of, by proxy, which I've already been talking about. There's no equality if people are still slaves. And people are still slaves. Let me talk about that. So you have what's called sharecropping, and I'll be real with you right now. There are white sharecroppers, but by proportion, it's all almost black people. You know why? Because people really, really still wanted slaves. And sharecroppers were almost better than slaves, because if they went to jail and then you said, hey, your sentence, you can get out if you do this sharecropping stuff. Well, then you got a slave again, but you don't have to pay for them because the state's paying for them. It's slavery all over again, and if you remember, Frederick Douglass says a thing about this: we're freed in name only. Although he does kind of believe in Reconstruction at first, he's quickly jaded when he realizes sharecroppers are indeed a thing, and they're terrible, and it's not fun. So around 1880s, sort of, we get a lot of civil rights cases, and these things, well, they actually end up weakening civil rights, if you can believe that. 1875, you have a Civil Rights Act that gets struck down by some cases. We get slaughterhouse cases, which basically weaken what the 14th Amendment means by saying only prohibited government violations of civil rights, not individual violations of civil rights. That doesn't make any sense, and it totally goes against selective incorporation. But that's a thing now, I guess. People will do anything to segregate other groups. It's kind of a bad thing. Anyways, around this same time, Plessy v. Ferguson happens, because this is sort of a semblance of keeping up equality in the 14th Amendment. They say separate but equal, which we all know gets overturned by Brown v. Board of Education, where they say separate is inherently unequal. And this is true. I mean, if you look at any pictures from those times, look at the white drinking fountain. Now look at the colored drinking fountain. Do you notice how one of them is way nicer and it's the one labeled white? That's because segregation is an ugly thing, and racism is terrible. Around this same time, you get a lot of gerrymandering, which is another way that they stopped them from voting, by packing them all into one particular area so their vote didn't count as much. So, let me move on from that cheerful topic. So, who are some people at this point in time who protested this? Well, of course, we had Frederick Douglass. We talk a little bit about William Lloyd Garrison and the Emancipator, which is still a newspaper around this time. And you get Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is a guy who supports Black Power long before Black Power is the name of the movement. Booker T. Washington basically says, if you can help yourself economically, then that's great, and that's better than any political power you can get, and may even lead to political power. This, of course, is contested by W.E.B. Du Bois, who says that we should struggle for equality in all things across the entire board. This is where they come into conflict. However, both believe in not creating much public agitation, as in like riots and stuff. They also both believe in racial solidarity, which is, of course, why the NAACP was made on Du Bois' side. A little bit about the ending, sort of Reconstruction. So you get the election, which we also call the corrupt bargain again. I guess there's a lot of corrupt bargains that happen. But you get a corrupt bargain where, instead of Tilden winning, you get Rutherford B. Hayes, or Rutherford B. Hayes. This was sort of a deal, though, because Rutherford said, basically, if you let me be president, I will stop Reconstruction. And that's exactly what he does, and that's exactly why African Americans kind of get the short end of the stick out of this. The very short end. Do they even get a stick? Anyways, at this point in time, the Tri-Case happened. The Ku Klux Klan, for any of you who were unfamiliar with that. So, political repression of African Americans happened, so most of them naturally want to leave. Lynching becomes a more common thing than ever at this point in time, so you get a lot of people moving up north, especially to Kansas, people called exodusters. Exodusters are also going to kind of evolve when Marcus Garvey enters the scene into Pan-Africanism, where most African American people want to go back to Africa. That's Marcus Garvey's plan, and a little later on. Hopefully that helped everybody. Hopefully those 3 sections were sufficient enough to help you kind of remember some stuff, get some reviewing done. Good luck with studying, and that's my bite on things.